only 15 years on mega projects. He must have started with smaller projects. There we go. But Waylon has promised to actually knock everybody out here. He's going to be the presenter that will just give you that. So that'll teach you to tell me something about what you're going to do.
No pressure, huh?
So in any event, I'm going to welcome Waylon up from S-Curve Solutions. Has anyone taken your microphone? Monica, can we get a microphone up here, Bubble? Somebody will come on.
No pressure on the intro, I guess.
Yeah, certainly not.
So I'm here because I believe in information, right? And I think if we deal with objective data, we get to move faster, we get to move more efficiently, we make better decisions. But I guess I'm also here in front of a room of technical people and engineers to talk about psychology, because we have a lot of experience that suggests that objective data is actually pretty hard to come by for a number of reasons, and it's pretty hard to get people to use it for a number of reasons. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what S-Curve does. As my colleague said, that I have to be able to, at some point in this conversation, tell you all that I'm hungry and I've got 3 kids in college and we need the work. So I'll save that for the end. Just real quick, these companies, everybody recognizes the names. These are all companies that are platform companies that deal in information. They're the five of the largest companies in the world. And you look at their market cap and you understand how integral handling information successfully is to their market share, their capex, the people that invest in their companies. And when we handle information, we do it a lot like this, all right? So this is a typical org chart structure that we have in our industry. And I think this structure is really well suited for implementing decisions or executing decisions, but it's really poorly structured for getting the information and gathering the information that you use to make decisions or to report or forecast things that project controls folks are really interested in. So, as I promised on the psychology, we're going to talk about a few books and a study and try to bring that home to some of the examples that could benefit us, I think, as leaders and everybody in the room. Just be aware of how we're handling information and what we're doing with it. So this is a great book. I don't know who in the room has had the pleasure to read it. Wisdom of Crowds. So there are 3 really interesting stories in this book. One covers the Challenger explosion, one covers the Columbia explosion, and in both of those cases what happened is small groups failed. So Challenger blew up basically because of an O-ring that could have been identified with a good quality program. They failed to identify that, and the Challenger blew up. The Columbia blew up on re-entry, missing a foam tile that was meant much more complicated than foam, but meant to be a heat shield. The crew aboard the Columbia never knew that piece was missing and that it was dangerous for it to be missing before they re-entered the atmosphere and blew up. Also in that book, there's a story about the Scorpion, which is a submarine that went down, and it was a hunter-killer submarine, so the location of it was not really well known. And they had a naval guy, and he assembled a captain, assembled a small team of people, kept them separated, provided everybody the same set of data, and then used Bayes' theorem to aggregate their views of where that submarine was going to be, and ended up within about 500 meters of it. So small groups work for some things, as long as we keep the information separate and independent. Otherwise, we kind of fall into a little bit of groupthink, and really what we get is one consensus view, and we often reach that consensus view too early. So for forecasting and reporting, that's bad. We really want independent data, and we want to keep the data independent and honest, and we don't want to put our views on that data until we get a chance to really get all of it. I don't know who here is familiar with this fellow, Stanley Milgram. He did experiments at Yale in the 1960s, and essentially what these experiments were designed to do was examine the degree to which normal German soldiers were at fault for following the orders that led to the Holocaust. And how Milgram constructed his study was basically set it up as a fake learning experiment where 2 people came in, they drew straws, but one person always worked with them. And so the idea was you would read a set of words to the other participants, and then they would respond back. You'd read the whole set, 30 words, 30 pairs of words, And at the end, they had to read those back. So you would read one word, you would prompt them, and they would tell you what the word was. And when they were wrong, you'd shock them. Little electric shocks. The shocks were fake, but the person administering the shocks didn't know that. And so the real test was, how far would that person go shocking people in that experiment, just at the behest of some person in a lab coat that seemed to have some legitimate authority in that experiment. So there were 30 shocks from 30 volts up to 450 volts. 375 was labeled severe shock, and that's important because
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering on less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher.
Cool, day, shade, water, cave. Answer, please. Are you all right in there? Are you all right?
Please continue, teacher.
What do you want, I keep giving him shocks?
Continue, please.
I'm up to 390.
Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there. Nice one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Answer, please. Are you all right? 405 volts. The answer is moon. Next one, heart, stone, head, bread, work. Answer, please. The answer is head, 420 volts. Next one, wet, night, grass, duck, cloth. The answer is duck, 435 volts. It says danger, severe shock here, next 6 on the next one.
Continue, please.
435 volts. Next one, brave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
But you think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the
But
experiment.
what if something's happened to the man had an attack or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take the shock, sir.
Please
I mean,
continue.
I don't tend to be rude, but I mean, I think you should look in on him.
Whether
All you gotta do is look at the door. If I don't get no answer, no noise, something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
We must continue. Go on, please.
You're gonna keep giving him what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White, cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer, please. The answer is horse, 450 volts. Next word, sad, face, music, clown, girl. The answer is face.
it's important because the last 8 shocks, the person that was receiving the shock was unresponsive. So you shocked them, and you shocked them, and it got worse and worse, and they screamed and they hollered. And then for the last 8 shocks, they were silent. And still 65% of the people that participated administered the last 8 shocks to a person that they should have thought was dead. Right? And that was just at the behest of a person in a lab coat going, I'll take responsibility for this. Or just a few other prods. And so as leaders in the industry, as leaders on your projects, what you have to be aware of is your opinion matters. And if you roll that opinion out at a point where you're really in a phase where you're trying to gather data, what you're going to hear is your opinion parroted back to you. And I see that in forecasts for cost. I see it in forecasts for schedule. I see it really, really bad in quantitative risk analysis. And we get called in to do a bit of that at different phases of the project. It matters a lot for funding, but it matters at all phases of the project. So you really have to guard against sort of letting the cat out of the bag about what your view is too quick. And you know, the traditional organization is set up to kind of do what you want it to do. And so if you let out too early what you want, that's what you'll hear back, and you'll drop out important information in that process. So these are some of the common psychological biases. We see loss aversion, I think, most clearly in LNG with the repeated lump sum contracts, right? So everybody thinks the lump sum contract gives them certainty. We've talked and heard several times this morning how it's not really certainty. It's a certain floor, but it's not a certain price. And again, I think to get a better idea of the price, you want to cast your net a little wider on the information. Anchoring bias. I've got an old colleague from ConocoPhillips present, and we were really bad about some point early FEL 0 or 1, somebody would roll out a cost and a schedule, and it was really hard to get that cost or that schedule to move as you approached FID, irrespective of the fact that your scope may have changed, may have gotten bigger. The schedule really needed to move, it doesn't. So the end date would stay the same, the budget would stay too much the same compared to the scope change, and then you miss. And so that I think part of the overruns that we experience as an industry are really associated with that. They're really associated with anchoring, and confirmation bias is the thing we just discussed. So as people know what our opinions of things ought to be, they'll seek out information that support those opinions, and they'll ignore other bits of information that might be valuable for putting together the forecast or figuring out where you're really going to be when you finish your project. So just a couple of quotes here. So conflict is super important. You have to be tolerant of people that have a different viewpoint than you as a leader. If you're not, you're not going to hear that viewpoint. And sometimes it's wrong, sometimes it's right, sometimes it's somewhere in the middle, and there's a bit of truth that you need to deal with, and maybe the conclusion is wrong, but the fact is right. So you just have to create an environment where you're really interested in hearing everything that you need to hear all the time to make these types of decisions, but make good project decisions, put together good forecasts. It's all about really gathering all the information you can and dealing with it in a very objective way. So these are, I took a course at Rice recently, and they threw this slide up for us. Any number of these inadequate or available insufficient resources, any number of these things are associated with some of what you lose from a performance standpoint if you're not really handling information well and honestly. It was kind of interesting to hear Miles talk earlier and relate handling data well to the HR sort of side of things and being able to match up people's needs with project needs or company needs. So I think we're all getting a little bit more focused on data, but we just have to get a little more comfortable with casting the net wide enough. So the title of our presentation was Reversing the Flow. And so what I sort of mean is, rather than having this, which is sort of the traditional organizational pyramid, we kind of put the leader at the bottom, right? At the bottom of the filter, where we're having all the information that's needed to make a good decision enter that filter, and then you get to consider it all. Where the other way, you sort of drop out things just as a function of gravity or organizational impetus or any number of other things. Oops, sorry. So this slide is intended to kind of demonstrate, like, risk are becoming parts of systems. We used to think of risk, in particular project risk, as this risk and that risk. But to ping on Mike again, he ran Cutter Gas for ConocoPhillips, the Cutter Gas 3 project for a good while. And we had issues with productivity, and we had issues with available resources for commissioning and startup. But if your productivity risk triggered, and you were a little bit late with your work, and you were trying to hold your end date, then you're exaggerating the risk that you have around available resources for startup and commissioning. So the risk work is a system, and we've kind of developed some modeling that lets us model things more as a system rather than independent risk, and early indications are that it gets us better answers around what your distribution of finishes and budgets look like, rather than the traditional sort of modeling and maybe where you model costs separately than schedule. We kind of bundle those things up now, and we use multiplicative impacts of risk that model the risk more like systems rather than independent events. So Super Forecasting is a great book. talks about anchoring a lot. I think the most encouraging thing in the book is it lays out things that we can all do to be better forecasters, and it supports a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of the way that we would handle data. The nice thing about the book is it's based on objective data. So Philip Tetlock is the person that made the phrase that experts are about as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee famous, but then did 20 years of research, and out of his 20 years of research, he was able to identify handfuls of people that were actually very good forecasters. And what did those folks do? Well, they took in as much data as they could to make a forecast or a decision, and then they considered new information and adjusted the forecast, and then did that again and again, and so it was a kind of a constant loop. It's what we try to do in project controls, but a lot of times we're really trying to pull data in that supports a particular message, rather than looking at all the information that we have. I'm doing some work on a project in Australia right now that has several $1 billion of claims going back and forth. And the interesting thing is you can go back to a point of the project and you can see that the project, well, the whole module program was laid. All of the foundations were laid at site. And yet the progress was, they were on progress and on plan. And you say, well, how can you be behind in all 4 mod yards from a progress standpoint? You haven't started mechanical work at site, you're behind all 4 mod yards, but you're on plan. Well, they're not on plan. They're saying they're on plan when they're not. And part of that is the responsibility of the people that handle the data, but part of it's a leadership issue. And so we all have to do a bit better job at taking some ownership and making those numbers real. It's really plain as day from looking at the information that I've had, where they were headed, and yet they weren't producing a forecast that was realistic. So internally within S-Curve, we've got a team of people that have worked together at different points in our careers, different places. I think we all have more than 20 years experience. So these are just a few of the rules that we use to make sure that we're putting information together that works to help us help projects make sure that they've got good budgets or good forecasts or a good risk analysis that shows a distribution that's realistic. If you start out an LNG project in FEL1 and you do quantitative risk analysis and your distribution is 6 months wide, I say you're a little bit narrow. So you need to go back to the drawing board and look at that. So that narrowness comes as you advance your project and you have a better idea of where things head. But early in the project, there's enough variability in the outcome for LNG that if it's that narrow, you should really sort of question where you're at. But we try to focus on the right data at the right time. So although our tools allow us to assess tons and tons of information at really high frequencies compared to 15 or 20 years ago, we try to hone in on the things from an LNG standpoint that we know are super important. When we go through risk identification, we really try to talk to everybody that we can. It's not unusual for us to do 60 or 80 individual interviews of a couple hours long to try to get the information from people. And invariably, in those interviews, I find risks that aren't in the risk register. I typically find something in the schedule that needs to be modeled a different way, the logic changed. I find sometimes that there's scope from outside of the project. The Freeport guys are talking about using power off the grid, and there's some places that they make that choice. I think Inpex made that choice to use power off the grid. The power supply was late. They had some challenges there. So when you use that external power, that's part of your project now. So you got to kind of look at that as part of the assessment. If you're on time in a vacuum, you don't have power to run the plant, it doesn't really matter that you're on time. So your investors aren't going to care and your buyers aren't going to care. So we try to drive consistency in those things that we look at. And so what we found is if we focus on the right things and we do that consistently, the information quality around those things improves. It really improves. And then selection of the team, as Miles mentioned earlier, the selection of the team is really important. Right now, we have a wealth of people out there that have good LNG experience, and I still run across a lot of projects that have folks staff on the project that don't have any. And you sort of have to wonder, with everybody that we have in the market that has that experience, why would you choose to put people on the project that didn't? So we model decisions as well, and I think probably the most important thing that I'm learning is, just like with process safety, having a process to make a decision is really important. We try not to encourage people using their guts to make decisions. Anything that we can model economically, we model economically. If we can put it in a decision tree and model it that way. However we can model it, what ends up happening is we force overlay of a process on that decision, and we find that we improve the decision quality a lot. And from the standpoint of diversity, it also helps improve your decision quality if you do get a diverse array of opinion in the room. So you don't try to gather the people that you think agree with you. You get everybody and let everybody have a little bit of a say, and it seems to help a lot in terms of your decision quality. I want to talk just a little bit about some of the things that we do that are a little bit different. I've been through a lot of benchmarking exercises. Early in my career, I wasn't really savvy enough to ask the right questions, but now I ask good questions. And so when somebody says to me, well, we have 30 benchmarks for LNG, and I'm working on Mozambique LNG, and I sort of say, really? So out of the 30 benchmarks you have, how many of those are in Africa? And they say, 4. And I go, well, how many of those are in Mozambique? And they say, 0. And I said, well, that makes a difference, right? So some things benchmark really well, equipment costs, those types of things, but execution, not so much. And general benchmarks are maybe useful for the bankers, but for project folk, those aren't the kinds of things that we should be using. So when somebody comes and they say, from FID to first cargo is 55 months. But if you build down in the Niger Delta, you've got 18 months of site prep to do, and if you build in Qatar, you have 3. And it's not the same project because of that. And so maybe a better benchmark would be something like first structural concrete to first cargo, something like that. And so the benchmarks need to be dialed around, especially for schedule. And when we do that, we'll find that they're a lot more informative. Just to dip a little bit more granularly into those benchmarks, and I think we have about 20 or 25 things that we look at across about 13 projects now. We don't look at any estimated data. We look at only as-built data. And because of that, we don't have as much data as other people have, but we're getting there. But I guess what I would say is, if you look at INPEX or Gorgon and they funded 25 billion and finish at 40 or 50 billion, you don't really want to benchmark them using their estimates. You want to benchmark them using their actual finish. I think INPEX started the same time that we started Australia Pacific LNG, both around May, June, July 2011. We had a cargo first week of January of 2016. They had a cargo in October of 2018. So a little bit of difference, just a little bit. Here's our QRA process, and really what I want to talk about mostly here is you can see that kind of funnel effect coming down, and where we really see the data quality being advanced here is the difference between gathering data in individual interviews versus gathering data in workshops. From a project standpoint, it's really more disruptive and more hours for your project teams to have the workshop. And if I put 30 people in a workshop, 8 hours long, I've spent 240 hours. I do 100 hours of interviews, 100 people, an hour each. I've used 100 hours of my time, but I've only used 100 hours of your team's time. I get way, way better data one way than the other. Mike and I worked with a guy at ConocoPhillips named Mike Elliott, and I used to call him Obi-Wan, because if Mike got up in front of the room and talked, everybody ended up believing what Mike believed. And that's good from a leadership standpoint and getting people behind you and working, but from the standpoint of doing risk analysis, it's horrible, right? Because all I would get is the same opinion about the same, about a given risk from everyone in the room, which is not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for independent sample size, and that drives data quality. Another tool that we've used pretty successfully, and I partner with a company in Australia that we developed this with, is SMART. So it's site mapping and resource tracking. And what this allows us to do is sort of insert an extra little component in the personnel badge, and we can virtually overlay your construction areas onto a plan, and then give you heat maps of where the people are moving around during the day at whatever increment you choose, 1 minute, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. And it really, really is super helpful for assessing productivity. So, there are a lot of times where the claims on an LNG project can turn into 9-figure numbers. And if you're not in a position to have a really educated discussion about productivity, you're kind of at the mercy of the people that own the data. And so sometimes it's really good to have your own information used, and this produces that information for us. So we found this really successful in doing claims work on the back end, where projects have implemented this and had it during execution. Of course, so far we've only used it on a few smaller projects, $100 to $150 million that have completed. We hadn't had a chance to deploy it on a big LNG project yet, but I think that'll come. I don't know if it's first here or first Australia, but a lot of people have had issues with productivity claims and are really interested in the technology. There's a couple of other things that we were doing at S-Curve that are a little bit unique, and my experience on Mozambique LNG suggested to me that there were social risks and there were disaster crisis risks, and we weren't really doing anything to assess those risks with real information. And so I've partnered up with a company called Inodo, and what they specialize in is social risk, and they gather actual data to do that. I'm gonna make you email me or come see me to tell you a little bit more about it, but the big point is you get some actual hard data to use, and whether or not you agree with the conclusions, you get the actual hard data yourself and you can draw your own conclusions with it. And the other thing is a company called Garner, that a guy actually happens to live next door to me that is a specialist in disaster and crisis management. And after COVID and seeing some other things, or doing projects in different parts of the world where maybe you have a little insurgency or you have this problem or that problem, having a plan in place is really helpful for that. And John and Garner specialize in helping us get that plan in place and giving a provisional price to that plan. So not only do you have a plan when something goes wrong, you kind of have an idea of what it's going to cost you to try to mitigate it a little bit. So that's it.
That was very sudden end. Obviously,
At the end.
as the end as it goes. So I don't have any questions on Sligo at the moment. Does anyone feel inclined to test the system here and the S-curve business? You can't ask him about anything that's under a non-disclosure agreement where he's dealing with billions of dollars of either some contractor or some client's business. So if that's all you're interested in, talk to him in private afterwards. We have a question over here.
There we go. Waylon, what can you tell us about how you manage nested risk?
Well, I guess the big difference is going to be that how we do that is with ranges. So the way we model the ranges is constant variance, and then we use multiplicative factors on the risk. So when you can identify pairs or series of risks that happen together, we use a modeling software that allows us to look at those risks multiplicatively. And we have a lot of discussion in the industry around system risk and other things, but I really think that most of the extreme results that we see in the industry are a result of these risks, that when one risk happens to its kind of worst case, it causes other risks to happen to their worst case. I think that's really what's driving us, rather than necessarily how we handle quote system risk. It's the multiplicative risks that are really kind of doing us in the extreme cases. And so we just model the multiplicative nature of those risks. And we do depend a little bit on the teams to help us identify which risk they think that would be, but fortunately for LNG, we have a pretty good background and experience that kind of tell us where to head with that. And so we try to nudge people in that direction and ask questions that help us range things and keep that in mind. The modeling software lets us do that.
Could you give us an example?
Yeah, the example that I gave earlier is really good. It's the productivity risk on cutter gas, and then the risk of whether or not you were going to have available resources to hit that commissioning and startup period effectively. And I think, of course, the thing that I'm not mentioning is the ConocoPhillips project. We were third in line, right? So you had resources that were being drawn by two other projects first. And Mike did some really interesting work on a closeout report that was super, super thorough. But I think that work connected those risks really well. You could see it in there pretty plainly. But that's an easy one. I think you might look at productivity and camp availability. right? So if you're in Australia and you're having to build a camp, and all of a sudden you're building your camp near capacity, and maybe you do your EIA where you have 500 beds extra, but it's not unusual to need 2,000 or 3,000 extra people. And then so camp availability starts being an issue, and the other risks start triggering that.
Any further? Sorry. Any further questions? If not, then let's give everyone a big round of applause. Stereo.
Yeah. Good job.
Okay.
Was it?
Testing your mind.